The year was 1911, or maybe 1912. Either way, it was a bleary afternoon in the growing boomtown of Electra in Wichita Falls, Texas. A powerful young man with a sauntering gait, bordering on a limp, lumbered into the only cafe in town, joined by his newly acquainted boss. He was looking for a warm meal after a hard day. It was his first day in Electra and his first day on the job as a mule driver, hired just that same morning after helping dig out a buggy. He'd come to Electra for oil money, but mule money would have to do for now. He spent his first night in town sleeping on the porch of the local inn, greeted by a rainstorm that made sure he'd get just about no shut-eye. Weeks ago, he'd been skipping classes and enjoying the finest parties Baylor University had to offer. Then his dad died, which meant his days as a student were done. He walked into that cafe tired, broke, and in no mood for taking any shit. Packed with customers, the pair pushed through heavy masses of dust, dirt, and the smell of hard labor, until the man and his boss managed to order 2 bowls of soup. The cafe owner, a proud Greek fellow, well accustomed to having the only diner in town, dismissively shoved 2 helpings of chili towards them. "I wanted soup," barked the young Texan. His confident southern drawl struck a raspy chord after a night in the rain. He pushed the chili right back to the owner. The Greek waved a finger at him and said, "Eat soup like a man. Don't be a sissy." He slammed the bowl of chili into the man's chest. Big mistake. Sid Richardson had finally had enough. He picked up that bowl of chili and threw it right in the Greek man's face. The bowl shattered, and the store owner was covered in hot, red goop. Shouting insults in Plato's parlance, the Greek leapt over the counter between them, ready for a fight. His face met squarely with a well-timed cross from Sid, surely not the first punch the man had thrown, flinging him back over the bar. Furious, the cafe owner lunged at him again. Sid's new boss looked on as these 2 men, a middle-aged Greek and a young, loud-mouthed Texan, punched and grappled their way out the door and onto the dirt road outside the shop. The fight went on for nearly an hour, until a hook from Sid finally kept the Greek on the ground. As the dust settled, he lumbered over to the man and extended a hand to help him up. As the Greek took it and began to stand, Sid slid a knife out of his boot, pressed it into the store owner's belly, his back to the crowd so only the 2 men knew it was there. A low voice in the Greek man's ear said, "Now you better stop all this nonsense, or I'm going to cut you open and see what you had for breakfast." Of course, the Hellenic hash slinger knew he was beat and called it quits. For years after that, Sid Richardson would walk into that cafe, exchange customary cuss words with the owner, and enjoy a bowl of soup, or whatever the hell he felt like having that day. Sound unlikely, exaggerated, some vague details? Well, buckle up, because Sid's whole life story sounds like something between an embellished fishtale and a frontiersman's fever dream. Notoriously private, he had no biographer, which is rare for a man of his stature in American history. He didn't keep a journal, and he lived almost his entire life as a consummate bachelor. He once told famous preacher Billy Graham, "Don't put anything in writing. If you use the phone, they can never use it against you." While that advice may not have aged well in the days of Snowden and Snapchat, it made Sid a legend and left behind a lasting legacy. One thing's for certain though, when you think Texas oil, you should think Sid Richardson. Perhaps no other man better embodies the hard scrabble, feast or famine, adventurous spirit of Texan energy entrepreneurship. Sid's life was that of an early wildcatter. He had some big cojones and bet big, whenever and however much he could, often with other people's money. As Richardson himself said, "I've been broke so many times, I thought it was habit forming." Sid reached some high peaks and low valleys in his life, both professionally and personally. But by the time he passed away in 1959, he had secured a legacy of philanthropy and enterprise that few Americans can match.
It can't be done, but I was born to run. Yeah, I was born for this, been through the storm for this. So if I'm wrong for this, then I'll be gone for this. But if I made it this far, then I can't slack now. You say it can't be done, but I was born to run.
Sid Richardson was born in 1891 in Athens, Texas, to humble beginnings. While he would later make most of his money in oil, natural gas, and black carbon, his first taste of entrepreneurship was helping out on his dad's farm in Athens, Texas. His dad had some farmland, cattle, and a peach orchard. A buggy accident when he was a young man left his leg crushed below the knee. And like much of Sid's life, the details of the accident are shrouded in mystery. The age at which this happened and even which leg it happened to is still debated. Regardless, it left Sid with a pretty nasty limp, which he worked hard to cover up. Proudly discussing the signature swagger he developed from the injury, Sid said, "I practiced me a walk that wouldn't make me limp. That swing and walk of mine is my own invention." As for Sid's dad, his favorite lessons to teach his boy were from the school of hard knocks. He sold Sid a lot on the farm, then traded him the lot for a bull, leaving Sid to realize he now had nowhere to put it and no cows for him to breed it with. He later promised Sid if he worked for the farm all summer, he'd give him a horse. Sid happily obliged, only to receive a blind horse at the end of the summer. Sid would later credit his dad for his early business acumen. As his father told him after the horse trade, people will try and get at you any way they can, and you might as well learn now. Richardson picked things up quickly, and by the time he finished high school, around 1910, he claimed he had made north of $3,500 trading cattle, worth more than $100 grand today. Now, if you're not taking that number with a healthy chunk of salt, you don't know Sid well enough yet. It was during his teenage years he befriended a whip-smart 11-year-old boy who would turn out to be a lifelong friend, business partner, and fellow multimillionaire wildcatter, Clint Murchison. He and Murchison got their start early in entrepreneurship. Whenever Sid went, Clint tagged along, learning and running the hard numbers to complement Sid's business intuition. Why a high school kid would pal around with an 11-year-old can best be explained by Sid's ability to water the right relationships, a skill that would one day let him bend the ear of 3 different US presidents. Not only was the young Clint Murchison a business wonder kid, but his dad had deep pockets that Sid would one day tap for his oil schemes. Aside from a knack for networking, the other qualities that defined Sid's career were visible from the early days. As a kid, he had a reputation for racking up big debts. The local soda shop apparently had strict orders to never lend another Coke to that Richardson boy ever again, because he wouldn't good for it. He also showed an early talent for making dollars out of dimes and finding a crafty way to get the edge in a deal. One of Sid's favorite stories was how he and a young Clint Murchison used to go into town posing as ignorant city slickers trying to buy cattle. How pretending to be a Yankee would help you land a cheap heifer is beyond me. But Sid's love of the story shows one of his favorite and most used business tactics, using deception or some other subterfuge to get an edge. Basically, being on the other side of a blind horse sale, fostering the right relationships, operating on instinct, placing big bets even with borrowed money, and getting an edge with some good-hearted treachery are the recurring themes and tropes throughout his remarkable career. This combination of traits would throw him from the poorhouse to the penthouse and back again, creating perhaps the most fascinating self-made billionaire story in American history. Trickles, dry holes, gushers. After graduating from high school, Richardson used his earnings to give college a try, attending Baylor and Simmons universities from 1910 to 1912. Sid was a lazy student, but a brilliant one, with one professor telling him that he could have anything he wanted in life if he just set his whole mind to it, but he'd never be worth a damn if he didn't. Now, when his father passed away suddenly in his second year of college, Sid took his professor's advice, though perhaps not as he intended. He dropped out of school to take up the man's position as family breadwinner for his mom and sister. His eyes were on staking his claim to the oil boom in Fort Worth, Texas, where he'd end up spending most of his life. Though he'd go on to make millions, Sid had a hard scrabble start in the Texas oil game. He saved and struggled to make ends meet, constantly learning the oil trade and finding odd jobs in the industry wherever he could, building relationships and a reputation as a smart, tough guy who could get things done. During this time, Sid's favorite thing to do on the weekends was hang out at Westbrook Hotel, where he'd watch oil traders exchange property leases on the mezzanine floor, similar to brokers on the New York Stock Exchange. He watched thousands of dollars change hands as Oilman shouted out prices, and he knew he wanted in. On the advice of an old classmate who he'd ran into at the hotel, Sid took his Ford across the surrounding farmland, offering to buy leases from the local farmers to sell for profit back in town. Eventually, he landed one, writing a $100 check for 100 acres against 50 in his bank account. Sid's bet paid off, and he was able to sell the stake for $50,000 to establish Wildcatter Dick Griffin. He was officially in the oil business and wasted no time trying to multiply his winnings. Sid would slowly lose his chips betting on dry holes, but fortune kept finding him. The Top of the Hill casino, where Sid was a regular, offered him a job valuing oil leases, which eventually led him to becoming a partner in several oil projects with the owner, Fred Banning. After his friend Clint Murchison came back from World War I in 1919, he managed to convince him to join him in staking their claim. Backed by Clint's father, they were able to make a go of it pretty quickly. In a classic Richardson gambit, one of their first big wins was on a well at Buckburnett. Gulf Oil was drilling a test well, and it was what oilmen call a tight hole. Now, your definition and personal fondness of this phrase may differ, but tight hole in the industry is a well that's being kept totally secret. Richardson wanted in that tight hole, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. He heard a rumor that 2 oil executives would be coming by shortly to check it out. He convinced Clint to suit up and go with him that night to the drill site, pretending to be the big wigs. They asked the nightman for every detail on the well, and they sang like canaries. Gulf Oil thought it would be a gusher. After getting the scoop, Sid and Clint started snapping up all the adjacent oil properties, which quadrupled in value shortly after the well was proven. Sid and Clint were names in the Texas oil game, a status neither would lose during their lifetime. But the good times did not last long. In the early 1920s, the commodity market crashed, and the pair were left holding the bag, owning a hefty chunk of change to Murchison's father. While Clint could bounce back more easily thanks to his dad, Sid had no such bailout. He languished for much of the 1920s, selling off his holdings at bargain barrel rates just to make ends meet. He went from a penthouse suite in the Blackstone Hotel overlooking Fort Worth to progressively more modest abodes, until he eventually ended up living rent-free with his good friend Amon Carter, the publisher of Fort Worth's main newspaper. A drugstore down the street let him use the back area as an office, and the soda jerk even took Sid's calls for him. The oil bust of the 1920s dwindled his holdings, and his cash flow went negative thanks to all of his debts. In 1922, Sid faded into obscurity and got reacquainted with poverty for 6 years until the fall of 1928. Enter Charles Marsh. Now, because of a statewide drought, Charles Marsh was desperate to save his flagging cattle ranches and decided oil was going to be his only hope. He kept hearing the name Richardson, still a big name in Ward County oil, with or without a dime in his pocket. He thought, this is the guy who can lead me to black gold. Now at this point, Richardson was a very different person from the young gun who strutted into the Greek's Café nearly 15 years ago. Tempted by early success, tempered by a long run of failure, and a hard fall from grace. He was wiser and more tired for those years, but he hadn't lost an ounce of grit or that trademark charisma. When he met Marsh, he immediately saw opportunity and snapped back into action. Sid would spend the next 7 years spending Marsh's money and getting him to co-sign massive loans at the Fort Worth National Bank finding the occasional trickle but mostly bleeding their cash. He backed both Marsh and the bank into such a big debt trap that they couldn't help but keep backing him. The alternative was writing off multi-million-dollar losses. Marsh and the banks were getting more and more worried by the day, but their bet on Richardson was soon to pay off. In 1935, Sid was hearing a lot of scuttlebutt about some explorations in the far northern Winkler County near the border with New Mexico. He would later make what looked like a brazen bet on this area. As his nephew and business partner Perry Bass would later tell it, Sid had some inside info. True to form, he'd befriended 2 female switch operators at the main switching station in West Texas. That means that just about all long-distance calls, meaning calls that weren't here on Sioux up the road, went through these ladies. The story goes that they would call old Sid and invite him to listen in whenever Gulf Oil or any other drillers were on the line. That's how Sid ended up catching wind of the find of the decade. He used most of Marsh's investment and the bank's credit snapping up properties in what would become the Keystone Oilfields. As you probably know, the bet paid off, big time. Sid swore that of the 80+ wells he drilled over the 5 years in the Keystone, not a single one was dry. As the money flowed in, Sid had some unfinished business. He marched into the drugstore that had given him a free office during those dark, hard-scrabble years. As he tells it, he looked dead in the eyes of the soda jerk Jack Collier, who had taken so many calls answering Sid Richardson's office when Sid didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. He asked him what he would do if he had a lot of money. Collier replied casually, "Well, I'd like to own this drugstore." Sid simply said, "You do." The story holds water, as Collier did become the owner of the store on that day, as well as another store Sid bought for him. He left both to Sid after his death, and Sid never sold any of them. And so it was that Sid's roller coaster of rags to riches finally settling on the ladder. From the mid-1930s on, Richardson's career was defined by a string of big wins. He made just as much money in natural gas as he did in oil and purchased a black carbon plant in Odessa, Texas in 1948. At the time of its acquisition in 2016, his black carbon company was the largest producer in North America. Like he always said he'd do, like he always knew he would, even when all signs said otherwise, Sid made the big rich. The big rich, playing politics. Throughout his life, Richardson used his tremendous wealth, personality, and connections, or whichever of the 3 he had at the time, to impact the energy sector and the highest levels of US politics. While still a poor man, or maybe better described as between riches, he met FDR's dainty, patrician son, Elliot, at a livestock show in 1933. Sid was enjoying the show with fellow Wildcatter royalty Clint Murchison and Charles Roser. The 3 of them saw a valuable friend in Elliot. As the president's son later wrote, "I met Charles Roser, whose wells were earning him some money, and Sid Richardson, who had none, since the holes he was drilling seemed to be fatted to be dry." Both men, along with another Clint Murchison, whom I met later, were to show a certain interest in my career while father was in the White House. I was vaguely aware that I was being sized up as a prospect. A real courtship was due to follow. Elliot apparently enjoyed the courtship for his own reasons, but Sid and the other Wildcatters clearly had their eyes on his father. The friendship bore fruit. All 3 oilmen, but especially Sid, would develop a strong relationship with Roosevelt. The following year, FDR visited Murchison's Island in Galveston, Texas. Faced with the question of how to get the wheelchair-bound president off the boat, which had no ramp, Richardson suggested using the boat's bull chute. "Incest," FDR yelled. "Sid, do you honestly mean to roll me down that bull chute?" Without skipping a beat, Sid just flashed his signature grin and replied, "Why, Mr. President, you're the biggest bull that ever went down that chute." FDR must have liked the man's charisma, or maybe his candor. Whatever Sid had, the president famously preferred his counsel to the major oil companies that were never far from Washington or Wall Street. During World War II, FDR regularly grilled Richardson about oil supply, and Sid became one of the president's most trusted energy advisors. In return, Richardson was able to protect oil interests for himself and his fellow Wildcatters. Richardson would also go on to develop a friendship with Dwight Eisenhower. Along with his business partner and close friend Amon Carter, he contributed large sums to Eisenhower's election in 1952. His greatest reward for the effort was Eisenhower installing close friend and Texas rancher Robert B. Anderson as Secretary of the Navy. Why would an oil man care who's in charge of the Navy? At the time, the U.S. Navy was the single largest purchaser of oil in the world. In the months that followed, Sid's monthly sales to the Navy went through the roof. While lucrative in the relationship's heyday, an issue over whether gas reserves in the Gulf of Mexico were federal property ultimately lost Eisenhower's support among the oilmen in 1956. Eisenhower would later express disgust at how much Texas oil tycoons had infiltrated national politics. It wasn't just politics or oil that Sid and his gang threw their weight into. In 1954, along with Clint Murchison, Richardson chipped in $20 million to help out their buddy Robert Ralph Young win control of the New York Central Railroad. The railroad was an American institution, the most highly valued in the country at $2.7 billion. Antitrust concerns and even a Senate inquiry were swatted away by the Wildcatters' allies in Washington, but they couldn't keep the press from connecting the dots. Between hostile takeovers and visible influence over the government, the public started to take notice of Sid and his friends' adventures. A man is getting in a hell of a shape if he can't buy something without people wanting to know what he's doing. Sid lamented over his newfound infamy. Richardson and his fellow Texan oil magnates developed a reputation as fast-moving robber barons in the tradition of the last century's monopolists. Whether or not that was a fair description is up for debate, but Sid definitely knew how to pull the levers of power and didn't have any shame about doing it. Sid's company holdings, which included the Sid Richardson Company and Sid Richardson Carbon and Gasoline Company, appreciated quickly in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. At the time of his death, Sid had an estimated net worth of between $400 and $700 million, making him one of the richest men in America, richer than the likes of Henry Ford II and Howard Hughes. The distinction apparently mattered little to Sid, who once said, "After the first 100 million, who gives a damn?" Though Richardson never married or had children, earning him the moniker the Bachelor Billionaire, he took his sister Annie's son, Perry Bass, under his wing, particularly after his dad passed away in 1933. Perhaps inspired by his dad's tough love, Sid initiated his new business partner by entrusting the recently graduated engineer with building him an island estate on a shoestring budget. Perry proved up to the task. Impressed by his ingenuity and engineering skills, he made his nephew a 25% partner in his oil estate. 2 years later, his productive West Texas oil fields would make those holdings worth tens of millions. His professional legacy was largely carried on by Perry Bass and his sons, who inherited some of his wealth and company holdings, with the rest going to his charity projects. He was an ardent philanthropist and used his massive wealth to fund public arts and economic development projects. In 1953, Richardson and Clint Murchison, his close friend and partner in enterprise for all those years, joined for one last job. They founded Boys Incorporated, a charitable organization for rehabilitating delinquent youth. Today, the Sid W. Richardson Foundation furthers its namesake's cause by contributing to programs that improve the lives of Texans, from public health to education and the arts. Sid was particularly interested in the arts, supported two artists that he felt were the most emblematic of the Old West, Frederick Remington and Charles Russell. Their paintings showcase the lifestyle and beauty of the Texas frontier. It's easy to see how Sid took to these subjects, as a Texan's life was defined by scrappiness, a willingness, some might even say need, to take big risks, and the ability to always get back on the horse after a tough fall. Today, the Sid Richardson Museum in Fort Worth houses an admission-free permanent art collection featuring many of their most iconic paintings. Sid Richardson embodied the freewheeling spirit of the Texas Wildcatters, making smart, bold bets that ultimately paid off big. He was crafty, charismatic, and never wasted a friendship or suffered an insult. He's Texas Oil incarnate, the good, the bad, and the ugly.